Have you ever felt like someone is following you?
Please! Please, my daughter! Oh.
Have you ever felt like someone is watching you?
Because you can see over the fence without anyone noticing what you're doing.
Well, this case offers you a similar experience revolving around Mr. Cruel.
Mr. Cruel.
Mr. Cruel.
Mr. Cruel.
He didn't stop at just stalking people.
Is to have Nikki back.
He left their kids traumatized for the rest of their lives.
This is a crime.
That affected individuals.
But the worst part about this case is that nobody knows who Mr. Cruel is.
Police posted a $1 million reward for information on the teenager's death.
Reward of $1 million.
This unidentified killer and child kidnapper might still be out there today, doing the same thing to other kids. So let's learn a little more about today's case revolving around this monster, Mr. Cruel. Mr. Cruel was a masked attacker who preyed on young girls throughout the 80s and 90s, and he still has not been identified to this day. It's believed that he was responsible for a dozen attacks in northeast Melbourne, but he's only officially been linked to 4. The first attack took place on August 22, 1987, in Lower Plenty, which is around 16 kilometers or 10 miles northeast of the Melbourne CBD, and the names of everybody involved in this particular attack had never been revealed. At around 4 a.m., while everybody in the family was asleep, a masked assailant, armed with a small handgun and a large hunting knife, removed a window pane from the living room and entered the house. He first entered the parents' bedroom and woke them up at gunpoint, pretending to seek money or their personal belongings. He then forced them to roll onto their stomachs and tied their hands and feet using a very specific knot commonly used by sailors, or those who frequently secure large loads. Next, he blindfolded and gagged them with surgical tape that he brought with him. Afterward, he compelled them into their wardrobe and locked them inside. He then made his way across the hall to their young son's bedroom. He blindfolded and gagged him with the same surgical tape and then tied him to his bed. Lastly, he made his way to the bedroom of their 11-year-old daughter. He took her, brought her to the nearby bathroom, and began sexually assaulting her. Over the next 2 hours, he took occasional breaks from this assault to wander around and search the house. He was clearly in no rush. He even stopped in the kitchen at one point to make himself some food. He also stole a couple of things from the house. He stole some money and jewelry, along with classical records and a blue coat with fake fur trimming. Using the family's home phone, he called someone he referred to as Bozo and made threats, saying, "You need to move your children. If you don't, I'm coming for them next." After the phone call, he left the house. Police were called in to investigate. They discovered that no calls had been made from the family's home phone, and the phone line had actually been cut before the intruder entered the house. So obviously, he was just pretending to be on the phone. He was trying to confuse the police, and because of that, it also seemed like the items he stole from the house were also another distraction, just used to try and conceal his true motives. And it became clear later on that this was definitely a trend of Mr. Cruel to leave distractions to try and throw police off. The second attack took place on the 27th of December in 1988 in Ringwood, which was about 20 kilometers, or 14 miles, east of Melbourne CBD, and also about 20 kilometers from the last attack in Lower Plenty. John and Julie Wills lived on Hillcrest Ave, Ringwood, with their 4 daughters, and by 5:30 a.m. that night, everybody was asleep. John and Julie in their master bedroom, and their 4 daughters, who slept in bunk beds in one of the other rooms. It was at this time that a man wearing a ski mask and blue overalls broke into the family home through the back door. He went straight to John and Julie's master bedroom, and Julie was woken up by a man standing over her with a gun pointed at her head. Immediately, she began screaming out for her daughters, telling them to run and get out of the house, and the man pushed the gun closer to her head and told her to shut up and stop screaming. He then pointed the gun at John's head and said, "Are you going to be a hero?" To which John shook his head and said no. The man then forced John and Julie to get onto their stomachs, and he tied them up again, just like he did in his last attack, but this time he tied them up with copper wire. He used a similar knot to the last time, the one that was used by sailors. He told them that he wanted all of the money in the house, and John directed him to the bedside table. There was $35 in cash in there, which he took, and he then blindfolded and gagged them with surgical tape, and then headed towards the room that the 4 girls were sleeping in. One of the 4 girls was 10-year-old Sharon Wills. She was described as a quiet, well-behaved girl. She was a choir girl with the Victorian Children's Choir and had appeared on TV with the choir just weeks prior. She had also been in the newspaper with her parents just before the attack. Additionally, her mother, Julie, had saved her from a burning bed. Sharon had woken up to her mother screaming, and she saw the masked man walk into the room. He called her by name, so it's possible that he had seen her family in the newspaper, or had seen Sharon on TV with her choir. It is believed that Mr. Cruel specifically picked out his victims weeks before his attacks, whether he had seen them getting off a bus stop, or had seen them in newspaper, or on TV. He would then stalk the family homes and lurk around them for days or weeks before the attacks. He blindfolded and gagged Sharon, picked up a few of her clothing items, and then carried her out into the night. 15 minutes after he left with Sharon, John and Julie managed to cut the copper wire that had been used to tie them up. They immediately ran into their daughter's rooms and realized that Sharon was missing. So John sprinted to his neighbor's house because he noticed that their phone lines had been cut. He used their phone to contact the police, and while the police were on the way, he went searching through the neighbors' yards, knocking on their doors. When police arrived, the Wills family home was cordoned off. The major crime squad was alerted, and a huge search of Ringwood and the surrounding area was conducted. The police searched cars and set up a police van. They really did everything they could, but they found no trace of Sharon.
To have your daughter taken and not know where she is indescribable. I'd just like to make people aware that you can't do enough to make your home more secure.
Initially, police believed Sharon was being held for ransom because the attacker asked for money and took the $35 that was on the bedside table.
Robbery is the only motive at this stage.
But no ransom demands were made. They quickly realized that this was probably just a distraction and that he was just trying to throw them off by stealing this money. Just after midnight, 18 hours after the attack, a woman found Sharon wrapped in green garbage bags on Orchard Road. She was wandering around just outside of Bayswater High School.
Shocked, bit numb, you know. You think, well, if they pick that house, who's next? There doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason that they'd pick, you know, the Wills' house.
She was taken straight to the hospital. Police were notified. And despite what she had gone through and all the trauma that she had to endure, she was so strong and brave and tried to be as helpful as possible to the police and tell them what she went through in the previous 18 hours. She said that when she was first abducted, she was taken for a long drive to a house. She said she was blindfolded and gagged for the entire 18 hours, and she was assaulted at the house. She said that she never saw his face and that when he wasn't assaulting her, he was kind and courteous, he was soft-spoken. She also said that he was really gentle. He fed her a sandwich and gave her some milk and some lemonade to drink, and one time, while she was alone in the bedroom, she actually very bravely lifted up her blindfold for a second so that she could get a look at the house that she was being held in. When she looked around, the first thing that she noticed was that there was a camera at the end of the bed facing the bed that she was on, so it's assumed the attacker was recording the entire ordeal. She also managed to describe the design of the bedroom. It had beige or cream carpet, peach-colored full-length curtains, a double bed with a peach-colored bedhead, a lamp with an orange base and a yellow and white striped shade, and light-colored walls and doors. There was a black or dark brown blanket over a bookcase or cabinet at one end of the room, and the radio had been playing constantly for the entire 18 hours. She also managed to describe what the bathroom layout was like. She said that the bathroom had a bath, a shower, and a glass sliding door. She described the house as being on a quiet street with little traffic. There were only a couple of steps to the front entrance, and the driveway was on the right side of the house. When he released her, he did so very carefully. He cleaned both himself and Sharon thoroughly, right down to the fact that he cleaned underneath her fingernails, clipped them, and even brushed and flossed her teeth. It was clear that he wanted to make sure there was no possible DNA or forensic evidence. He either kept or discarded Sharon's clothes. He then put her in a garbage bag and tied it up or taped it around her shoulders. He then put another garbage bag on top of her head, which he taped around her body, and on top of that, he put a men's white shirt. He then placed her in a car, drove her to Orchard Road, and let her out near Bayswater High School, which, as we mentioned earlier, was where she was found by a passing motorist. Based on the way that he cleaned both himself and Sharon to remove any possible forensic evidence that could tie him to the crime, it was theorized that this was a man who knew something about forensic evidence. He knew about forensic procedures, he knew what he had to do to avoid being caught, and it was clear that he came very prepared. John Wills did a press conference after Sharon's return, basically saying that he was so grateful for Sharon's return, that he was grateful for the police and their hard work, and that he was grateful for the woman who found Sharon.
Thank all my friends, my neighbours, my relatives. I'd like to thank the media for your coverage and your assistance to get my daughter back. And most of all, I'd like to thank a lovely lady who buys water. Thank you.
The police set up regular surveillance and patrols of the home to make sure that this didn't happen again. On January 2nd, 1989, 6 days after the attack, the Victorian state government offered a $100,000 reward for any information that could lead to the conviction of the attacker. After they announced this reward, they did get a few calls with possible leads. One caller said that at 11:15 p.m., on the night of Sharon's abduction, they saw a white Commodore with 3 stripes running down the side in Bayswater, and they thought it was acting kind of odd. As the Commodore was turning from Jersey Road onto Mountain Road, It had its lights off, and it nearly collided with another vehicle to the point where the other vehicle had to slam on the brakes and swerve to avoid it. The Commodore then just drove off and the other car followed it, and it pulled up next to the Commodore at a set of red lights. The other driver was trying to yell at the person in the Commodore through the windows, but the guy in the Commodore seemed to be a male. He seemed to be the only person in the car, and he also seemed to be really anxious and completely ignored this guy yelling at him.
He actually turned his head away from the view of the witness who was trying to have a look at him for various reasons, and pulled the car forward, trying to avoid showing his face to the other witnesses.
Just like he didn't even acknowledge that he was there. When the light went green, the Commodore continued straight for a short distance before turning right onto Church Road towards Bayswater High School. The driver of the other car didn't get a number plate or anything, and after getting this call, police actually set up a display of a similar car to this Commodore to try and, jog other people's memories and see if they could get any other leads from it. Police dropped off pamphlets in Ringwood and the surrounding suburbs with basic details of the attacks, as well as what they believed was a description of the attacker. The description was male, around 20 years old, wearing blue overalls and a ski mask. The next attack occurred 18 months later, on July 3, 1990, in Canterbury. The Linus family was a pretty well-off family from England. They were in Australia for Father Brian's job, as he was a partner at the accounting firm called Pricewaterhouse. They were actually just days away from moving back to England. Their bags were packed, they were done with work, and they were ready to go.
The evening Nikki was kidnapped was to be the family's last night in this home before returning to England on Sunday.
During their time in Melbourne, they had been renting a house on Monmouth Avenue, which is a very affluent street. Many high-ranking Australian politicians and high-ranking public officials also lived on the street. So on the night of July 3rd, Brian and Rosemary were out at a farewell dinner that was being held for them by some friends, and while they were out at dinner, their two daughters, 13-year-old Nicola and 15-year-old Fiona, were at home alone. By 11:40 p.m., the two girls were asleep, and a man in a black balaclava and dark clothes entered the house through a back window, armed with a handgun and a knife. He then tied 15-year-old Fiona up and told her, "Tell your father that I want $25,000. He then ordered Nicola into a separate room and told her to grab her Presbyterian ladies' college uniform, and he put her uniform and some underwear in a bag. He then took the keys to the family's rental car, which was a blue Balena sedan that was parked in the driveway of the home. He forced Nicola into the car and drove off, and this was all just days before her 14th birthday. 20 to 40 minutes later, Brian and Rosemary returned home, and the first thing they noticed was that their rental car wasn't in the driveway anymore. When they entered the house, they found that 13-year-old Nicola was missing and 15-year-old Fiona was tied up on her own bed with a ransom message to share. They immediately called the police, who showed up on the scene shortly, and they were unable to find any forensic evidence at the house. Brian and Rosemary made it very clear to the police that they were prepared to pay the ransom, they just needed to know where and how to pay it. So 2 police officers kept guard at the house. They also monitored all incoming calls, waiting for further instructions on how to pay the ransom, but that call never came.
We're really uncertain about it. It could have well been a throwaway line, or he may be serious about it. If he is serious about it, he hasn't contacted us.
Nicola's father, Brian, made a public plea for the safe return of his daughter. He stated his willingness to comply with the ransom demands and said, "We would very much like to have Nikki back with us.
Parents, that obviously all we want is to have Nikki back.
Whatever can be done to get her back, we would like it to be done. Anyone in this room who has children might understand the stress when you see one of your own family members taken away like that. We have to sit, be patient, and hold our nerves," Brian said. "One of the things that we have loved about Australia is the safety of the children on the streets, on trams, on public transport. It was fantastic. It gave the children a freedom that, certainly at their age, and as girls, we would never have let them have in London." In their investigations, police looked into Brian and his business dealings, thinking that the ransom may have been personal in nature, and that it may have had something to do with his business dealings. However, they did come up empty-handed on that line of inquiry. They questioned everybody who lived on Monmouth Avenue to see if anyone had seen or heard anything, but nobody had seen or heard anything suspicious. Police interviewed Nicola's classmates at Presbyterian Ladies College, but learned nothing of value there either.
Some of her close friends spent some time with one of our counsellors, just going through how they felt and what they could do to help.
At 3 a.m., the next day the rental car was found on Chaucer Crescent in Canterbury, which is just a few streets away from their family home. It was dusted for prints and DNA evidence, but DNA testing was still pretty new, so they didn't get much, and nothing else of note was found in the car. The Victorian state government also offered another $100,000 reward for any information that could lead to the conviction of Nicola's abductor. As the days went on and Nicola wasn't released, and she wasn't found, people obviously started to get more and more concerned. Sharon was released within 18 hours, and studies show that children who are abducted are 90% of the time murdered within the first 24 hours. But then, at 2 a.m., on July 6th, on Nicola's 14th birthday, and 50 hours after her abduction, she was released by her abductor in Kew, which is about 6 kilometers or 3.5 miles from her family's home in Canterbury. She was fully dressed, wrapped in a blanket, and blindfolded when he dropped her in front of the utility station. Once he drove off, she removed her blindfold, made her way to a nearby house, and immediately called her father, Brian.
We are obviously delighted to have Nikki back with us, safe and well.
Police were also notified, and Nicola was taken straight to the hospital. But unfortunately, for the first 2 to 3 hours, she wasn't able to see her parents because of the protocols that were in place. She instead had to spend those hours with psychiatrists and nurses, basically describing and reliving what had happened to her for those previous 50 hours. She was an extremely strong and brave girl. She told them that her abductor was around 175 centimeters tall, which she judged based on how tall he was in comparison to her. She said he had reddish-brown hair, was between 20 and 40 years old, and wore a green balaclava with cream stitching around the eyes and the mouth. She also said that he had a serrated kitchen knife with a 25-centimeter long black plastic handle. She said that he drove her around for about 10 minutes in her parents' rental before he stopped at Chaucer Street, which is about 10 minutes from her parents' house. She was then placed in another vehicle. A blanket was placed over her, and she was kept under the dashboard. She was then driven around for the next 45 minutes before being taken to the house where she was held captive for the next 50 hours. She was also able to give a brief description of the house she was being held in and the car the attacker drove because, just like Sharon, she bravely took her blindfold off a couple of times to see where she was being held captive. Just like Sharon, she was bathed and cleaned thoroughly before being released. She was also forced into a neck brace, which was fastened to the attacker's bed. She said that while she was there, she heard the attacker talk out loud to another person in the house, but she never heard a response and believed that he was there alone. The police thought this may have been another one of Mr. Cruel's red herrings. Nicola also said that the attacker actually watched her father's press conference and tried to talk to her about it. Police set up a roadblock in Canterbury, and they stopped every single car that came through the area and questioned them about whether they were in the area on the night of Nicola's disappearance, and if they had seen or heard anything suspicious.
I cannot thank the police enough for their magnificent efforts, long hours, and the personal caring they have given us and to this case.
The media also began reporting on the case and dubbed the attacker Mr. Cruel.
I would also like to thank the manner in which the responsible media have handled the case, in particular yesterday's media conference. I firmly believe the conference materially helped in bringing Nikki back to us.
And they also speculated that he may have been an ex-police officer just based on the way he cleaned his victims and destroyed any evidence or clues. It definitely seemed like he had some knowledge of forensic science. It was also at this time that police announced they believed Mr. Cruel was responsible for at least 6 attacks in the area since 1984. And people in Melbourne started to become fearful. People didn't want to take their children to babysitters.
She doesn't go to babysitters or anything. She's always with us.
Their children were having nightmares.
He's woken up with nightmares. What if someone comes in, Mum? And it's terrible. It's terrible for a 5-year-old to have to think like that.
And people were sleeping in the same rooms as their children. It was huge, and there was paranoia all throughout Melbourne. And then 9 months later, on April 13th, 1991, Mr. Cruel struck again.
Please, bring my daughter Karmen back to home, because all my family love her very much.
It was a normal day for the Chan family that day. That night, 13-year-old Karmen Chan was watching TV in her room with her 2 younger sisters, 9-year-old Carly and 7-year-old Karen, at their home in Serples Road in Templestowe, which is another affluent suburb around 16 kilometers northeast of Melbourne CBD. Karmen was a student at Presbyterian Ladies College, and just like Nicola, she was described as polite, kind, and enthusiastic. She was very hardworking, and she dreamed of one day becoming a barrister. Karmen and her younger sisters were home alone as their parents, John and Phyllis Chan, were working at one of their 2 Chinese restaurants. This one was just 10 minutes away in Lower Plenty, and this was a pretty typical night for the family, as John and Phyllis worked 15 to 18-hour days at their restaurants almost every single day. Since migrating from Hong Kong 16 years earlier, John and Phyllis had worked extremely hard to ensure their children would have a comfortable and happy life growing up, working long hours at their restaurants, and they also had a few investment properties in Victoria. It's believed that Mr. Cruel, just as he's believed to have done with the previous attacks, loitered around the family home and stalked the family home for a few days to a few weeks before the abduction, which is how he may have known that the girls would be alone at the time. The Chan family home was surrounded by a tall brick fence, and the property was accessible only via an electric security gate. At around 9 a.m., Mr. Cruel tampered with the security gate to gain access to the property. Upon entry, he spray-painted one of Chan's cars parked in the driveway. He wrote, "Payback, more to come, an Asian drug deal." It's believed he then entered the house through an unlocked door or window, as there were no signs of forced entry. By the time he got inside, Karmen and Carly were in the kitchen preparing to make themselves something to eat for dinner, and this was where they were confronted by a man in a green-gray tracksuit and a balaclava. He told them that he wasn't going to hurt them. He just wanted money. He forced them back into Karmen's bedroom, where they found Karen, who was curled up hiding behind the bedroom door. He forced the two young girls, Karen and Carly, into the bedroom closet and pushed the bed in front of it to lock them inside. Then he left with Karmen at around 9:30 p.m. 15 minutes later, Karen and Carly managed to get out of the closet. Carly immediately called her father, John, and told him that a man with a knife had abducted Karmen. He rushed home, searched the house from top to bottom, but unfortunately, Karmen wasn't there. He called the police, and immediately they made the connection between Karmen's abduction and Mr. Cruel's previous attacks.
I had a daughter of a similar age. I kept my feet on the ground because I was doing what I was doing to protect my own daughter.
Police dispatched everyone available, including a police helicopter and sniffer dogs. One dog picked up a scent and followed it north to Church Road, where it abruptly ended. Church Road was very close to the Chan family home, as they lived on the corner of Serples and Church Road, so it was assumed that he walked Karmen to his car nearby and drove her back to his house. Police sealed off all surrounding streets and interviewed everybody in the area, but nobody had seen or heard anything. They also released their latest description of Mr. Cruel based on Karen and Carly's descriptions. He was described as a 25 to 35-year-old man. He was a slim to medium build, around 180 centimeters, and he was last described as wearing gray sneakers, a green-gray tracksuit, and a balaclava. They also believed he was right-handed based on the way he had spray-painted the Chan family car. It's believed Mr. Cruel closely followed his own publicity. He watched news articles on himself, he watched press conferences, and he read all of the articles. And on the 16th of April, John and Phyllis Chan gave an extremely emotional press conference.
Very hard to sleep.
We couldn't sleep.
So we're hoping is the men understand, release her as soon as possible, so we can have a family together.
Please, release my daughter!
Phyllis was absolutely distraught and begged Mr. Cruel to return Karmen. 3 days later, on the 19th of April, Karmen's sisters Carly and Karen wrote open letters to their sister and Mr. Cruel. On Tuesday, April 23rd, it had been 10 days since Karmen had been abducted, which was far longer than any of the other victims. The Victorian state government offered another $100,000 reward for any information that could lead to the conviction of Mr. Cruel, which made the total reward $300,000. They contacted the FBI and Scotland Yard for help. By the 1st of May, they'd set up a special task force to investigate Mr. Cruel called Operation Spectrum, and it was headed by lead investigator David Sprague. He was also the lead investigator in Karmen's case.
Mr. Chan is not, no. He's a very well-respected man in the community.
They released colored posters with photos of Karmen, Nicola, and Sharon. It was printed in all major newspapers, displayed in every police station in Victoria, at railway stations, on Crime Stopper notice boards, and in shopping centers as well. On May 2nd, Karmen's mother, Phyllis, wrote an open letter to Mr. Cruel. It read, "To the man who took Karmen Chan, dear Mr. Kind, not Mr. Cruel, we miss Karmen very, very much. Please let Karmen go. We know you are a kind and caring person. We hope Karmen is safe with you. School has resumed, and it would be nice if Karmen could return to school. Thank you for letting her go, and we can rebuild our lives. Please hear our plea. Love from the Chan family. Father, mother, and sisters of Karmen." A few days later, by the 5th of May, police began to report that they believed Karmen had been murdered. On the 14th of May, they set up a roadblock out front of a bus stop on Main Street in Elphin, which is the bus stop Karmen used to get off at after school as it was close to her parents' restaurant. At this point, detectives believed he may have stalked Karmen after seeing her get off the bus. They questioned hundreds of motorists and handed out leaflets containing information about Karmen's abduction. They actually sent out leaflet-sized copies of the poster to 1.4 million homes, every single home in Victoria, and then some in New South Wales and South Australia as well. They put up around 100 billboards around Victoria. They also re-interviewed Nicola and Sharon, who had actually moved back to England. So they had to fly over to England to re-interview her. It had been a few months since both of their attacks, so they were hoping that they may have remembered some new information. Sharon told them that while she was being held captive, she heard loud, low-flying planes overhead, and this was actually something that Nicola had also told them previously. So because of this, police believed that Mr. Cruel's home, or the place where he took his victims, was under a direct flight path and was in proximity to Tullamarine Airport. So because of that, they went and checked out 30,000 houses in 15 different northern suburbs, trying to match them to the descriptions of the house given by Nicola and Sharon. Phyllis also wrote another open letter to Mr. Cruel. It read, "I beg you to release my daughter Karmen immediately. I'm longing for her safe return every minute of the day. I love her very, very much. I'm willing to offer my life in exchange for Karmen's release. Karmen's sisters Karen and Carly miss her very, very much. They trusted you on the night of April 13th. They had cooperated with you because you were calm and you looked kind. You had promised them that after you had gone, their sister would open the door for them. You have broken your promise. They are very upset. They blame themselves for trusting you and not being able to help Karmen. They feel very, very guilty now. Karen's birthday is at the end of May, and Carly's birthday is in June. Both girls say they want nothing but Karmen as their birthday present. Please send Karmen back home immediately. God bless you. Thank you very much. Love from Phyllis. Since the attack, Carly has also started sleepwalking. She would walk around saying, Karmen, where are you? Have you come back yet? The Chan family also wrote another letter, this time trying to bypass the police. They told Mr. Cruel that he could contact them by writing to a private postal address, and they gave this private postal address in sort of a code that he had to decipher by asking Karmen for the names of family friends in Hong Kong. Phyllis Chan said that if we do it through the police, he won't get in touch. Maybe he's at the stage to release her, but he's just too scared, and he could feel a little bit easier if he believes us. And then, as if the family weren't going through enough, on the 11th of July, a prisoner and a Federal Protective Services officer tried to extort them. Peter Allen Reed was serving 21 years in prison after shooting and killing a police officer, after stealing a car and getting into a car chase. He called John Chan on 6 separate occasions, saying he'd release Karmen if John would give him $15,000. He threatened to kill both John and Karmen if he didn't get the money, so John agreed to pay. Peter gave him a drop site and got Officer Vince DePaula to go to the drop site to collect it. But when Vince got there was no money. The police knew about the extortion. John had told them, and they put a trace on his phone after the first extortion call, so they ended up arresting both men. They questioned both men extensively about Karmen, and they didn't know where she was. They didn't know what had happened to her. They just wanted to take the chance while they were down and try to extort some money out of them. And then on the 9th of April in 1992, just a few days before the 1-year anniversary of Karmen's abduction, a man was walking his dog on a track that went through the State Electricity Commission terminal station in Thomastown, which is just 16 kilometers from the Chan family home. The area had recently been leveled by earthworks, which caused a shallow grave to be disturbed. About 20 meters away from Edgar's Creek, the man found a skull. He called the police, who uncovered the rest of the bones of the body. The police confirmed that the bones were those of Karmen Chan. She had been shot in the head 3 times. It was believed that it happened about a year prior to her bones being discovered. Although the exact date and location of what happened couldn't be determined, Phyllis Chan believed Karmen was not the type of girl to go down without a fight. She may have taken off her blindfold or removed Mr. Cruel's balaclava and seen his face. For that reason, he felt he had to kill her. This was obviously a massive jump from his previous attacks. He started off by not even abducting the girls, then he started returning them, and now he has murdered a girl, and the police don't believe the murder was planned. They believed he may have suffered from stress, anxiety, and depression. So they actually sent a letter to every single one of Victoria's 10,000 registered doctors, basically asking them to consider breaking doctor-patient confidentiality and telling them if there was anybody that they were kind of suspicious of. They also sent these doctors a description of Mr. Cruel, the crimes, and some other general information. Many doctors did respond to the letter, and the police said they did receive some useful information. Task Force Spectrum actually also looked into John Chan. Because of the writing on the car, saying something like payback, an Asian drug deal, they explored the possibility that John was involved in some sort of underground drug dealing, and that maybe Mr. Cruel wasn't involved at all, and this was actually some sort of vendetta against John. And not only just because of the writing on the car, but also because of the execution-style murder, and because of the fact that Mr. Cruel hadn't previously murdered any of his victims. John swears he had nothing to do with it, and that he works from 8 a.m. until midnight almost every single day and wouldn't have any time to be involved in drug dealings. There was no evidence to link him to the murder, and Task Force Spectrum did exhaust this line of inquiry.
I swear I do nothing wrong, and I've been here 15 years, always in business. I start 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock in the morning and finish at midnight. I work hard, I know a good opportunity to Australia.
But it had never been fully excluded. Though some officers from the task force do believe that this line of inquiry wasn't looked into enough, in January of 1993, police released sketches of the bedroom and bathroom of Mr. Cruel's house, drawn by one of the victims, in the hopes that somebody would recognize them and contact the police. Police did receive around 1,400 calls from the public after this was released, and every single line of inquiry was looked into, but all were eliminated. In June of 1993, Task Force Spectrum was scaled down from 40 officers to 10, and it was eventually disbanded by January of 1994. It was actually the largest task force in Victorian state history. Up until that point, 27,000 people were interviewed, 10,800 leads were investigated, 910,000 kilometers, or 565,000 miles, were traveled investigating those leads, 30,000 houses were searched, and the investigation cost about $3.8 million. The decision to disband the task force was supported by Phyllis. She said that the police were amazing. They did everything that they could, but they just couldn't figure out who Mr. Cruel was. Karmen's murder took a huge toll on Phyllis. She and John ended up getting a divorce because of the strain from all of the press conferences and from just dealing with a daughter who had been abducted and murdered. After the divorce, Phyllis went through some pretty big financial difficulties. She lost her house and her car, and she just held on to a restaurant. One night in early 1995, Phyllis returned home at around 12:30 a.m. after a 16-hour workday, and as she was carrying some things from her car into her house, she was bashed on the back of the head with a wooden object. She was then bashed in the head several more times before the attacker took off with the money that she had on her. She required surgery and 60 stitches and was in the hospital for over a week. And it turned out the attacker was actually an ex-employee. In 2016, on the 25th anniversary of Karmen's abduction, the Victorian state government announced a $1 million reward for any information that would lead to the conviction of her killer.
Police posted a $1 million reward for information on the teenager's death.
After Karmen's abduction, there were no other crimes that were linked to Mr. Cruel in Victoria. It is a theory that he didn't want to kill Karmen, but she took her blindfold off or took his balaclava off and saw who he was, and so he felt like he had to kill her, and that scared him into stopping his crime spree altogether. Another theory is that he moved to another state or even another country and continued his crime spree. From state to state, even within Australia, there was no centralized database or universal system to share information about cases. It's unfortunate, but it means that he could have moved to another state and continued his crime spree, and because there was no database to pick it up, it was just never discovered. Joseph James D'Angelo was caught in 2018, and he is the Golden State Killer or East Area Rapist, one of the most literal, wild human beings to ever walk this earth. But before they caught him, some people believed that Mr. Cruel was the Golden State Killer who would come to Australia to continue his crime spree. At one point in the case, the police had 76 suspects. To this day, there are still 7 suspects who had the propensity to commit this sort of crime, who had committed similar crimes in the past and have never been ruled out. The prime suspect was a former Melbourne University lecturer named Brian Inkler. This is the guy that David Sprague, the man who was the head of the task force and the lead investigator in Karmen Chan's case, believed was their guy. He was jailed for 10 years in the 1970s after pleading guilty to tying up and attacking 6 girls at knife point over a 2-year period. His house was actually raided after Karmen Chan's disappearance, and in his attic they found a balaclava and a knife. And Mr. Cruel was known to wear a balaclava and use a knife. There was no forensic evidence to support the case, there were no witnesses, he denied it, and they've never been able to prove that he had anything to do with it. And the worst part of it is that the police actually lost a lot of forensic evidence in this case. They had collected items like tape and wire and taken DNA swabs from previous attacks, but they got lost. So as DNA testing became more advanced, they weren't able to utilize it because much of the forensic evidence was lost. Although Mr. Cruel has never been identified, this case did force a change in the Victorian state government justice system. Stalking and sex offenders loitering in school areas became crimes because of this case. Task Force Spectrum did arrest 75 sex offenders during their 3-year course, even if they weren't Mr. Cruel. Please take care of yourself and your loved ones. We will be back with another mysterious true crime documentary.